Welcome everyone. I'm Jane Collis, the Information Coordinator here at Aussie Deaf Kids. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce you to Kate Crowe and Pauline van der Straten-Way. Kate and Pauline are both speech language pathologists and have an abundance of clinical experience with linguistics and children who have sensory disabilities. They also have a PhD each and have carried out research on this topic. So I'll now hand you over to Kate and Pauline. I'll stop sharing my screen and you guys can share yours.
Thank you so much for inviting us to speak with you today about the topic of deaf and hard of hearing children who are multilingual language learners. It's really our pleasure. We so much enjoy speaking to parents, sometimes much more than speaking to professionals, because we feel that that's where our work actually has the real impact, and we can see it when we talk to parents. So the things we're going to be talking about today are just multilingualism in general and who are deaf multilingual learners and their characteristics. And then we'll also be talking about deaf multilingual learners and what multilingual acquisition of language looks like and what it looks like to foster language acquisition when you're living in a multilingual environment. And then we'll also be available to answer any questions that you may have. So Pauline is going to start with multilingualism and deaf multilingual learners.
Thank you, Kate. So who is deaf multilingual learner? And is multilingualism something normal? And your perception might really depend on your own experiences and the experiences of the people around you. Globally, there are around 8,000 living languages, and more than half of all people are multilingual. The rates of people who use languages other than the dominant community language at home are around 20% in countries such as the US, Canada, and Australia. In Europe, multilingualism is much more frequent, with 54% of people reporting they can hold a conversation in at least 2 languages. And this is just an average of all of Europe. For example, in Finland, 75% of people report conversation level skills in 2 languages, and 48% in 3 languages, and 26% in 4 languages. So whether multilingualism is normal or not is often defined by the people around you. For example, I have a colleague here at the university in Brussels, because I am in Brussels, so I work in a French-speaking university. My colleague is native of Dutch. He's doing his PhD here in a French-speaking university and uses Dutch, French, and English on a daily basis. The other day we were discussing multilingualism. The discussion was mostly in English with some Dutch and French, and he told me, "Oh, I regret not being multilingual." Is he? Is he not? Who is multilingual? And who is a multilingual learner? So we are using here a broad and inclusive definition. Learners who are multilingual are able to comprehend and or produce 2 or more languages in oral, manual, or written form with at least a basic level of functional proficiency or use, regardless of the age at which the languages were learned. So this could include a learner who speaks English at school and Hindi at home, a learner who uses Auslan and English at school, but the child's family uses Vietnamese at home, a learner who is exposed to Arabic and English at home, English at school, and Cantonese is abundant in the child's community, or a learner who uses Auslan at home, English at school, and who is learning French and Japanese as part of their high school curriculum. So a deaf multilingual learner is a learner who is deaf or hard of hearing and multilingual, which seems rather obvious and uncontentious. Okay. But however, this term is usually used to refer only to deaf and hard of hearing children who are learning 2 or more spoken languages, with or without the use of sign languages and or sign communication systems. We recognize that a child learning a sign language and a spoken language is also bilingual, although these children are usually referred to as bimodal bilinguals. There is a lot of research about interventions for bimodal bilingual learners, and this has been a focus of the literature for quite some time. However, there is very little research about deaf multilingual learners who use 2 or more spoken languages. So then, who is a deaf multilingual learner? They are children and students who may be bilingual, trilingual, or even quadrilingual. They might live in monolingual environments, for example, using one language at home and a different language at school. Or they could use one of their languages at home and at school. Deaf multilingual learners could start to learn 2 or more languages from birth, and they could learn additional languages at any age. And they may be monomodal or bimodal multilinguals using 2 or more spoken languages, or a combination of spoken languages and signed languages. So as a group, deaf multilingual learners are very diverse in the number of languages they use, when and where these are learned and used, and which modalities their languages are in. But as a group, deaf multilingual learners are extremely heterogeneous, which makes them a particularly hard group to get your head around as professionals. But why are they so heterogeneous? Deaf multilingual learners are heterogeneous because they are at the intersection of several groups known for their diversity. Deaf learners can be very different in lots of ways that impact on how they learn language and grow in the world. Likewise, learners who are multilingual are also very diverse in important ways. In addition, the cultural diversity of learners add another layer of meaningful differences. The realistic view of deaf multilingual learners is much richer, but also more complex than just speaking more than one language.
Okay. So before we really go into talking about multilingual language acquisition, there's a few things that we need to clear up. And understanding these things will really help us understand what role we can play and how we can support these learners and blossoming as language learners. So I'm not going to spend time on this because this is very common knowledge amongst the group, but there is a lot of myths about language when it comes to deaf and hard of hearing children or children with hearing loss. So those myths are out there. They're on the screen. They're a myth. But we're going to speak more specifically about what happens when it comes to multilingualism. So these are just some common myths that we've collected up and we'd like to deal with today. So that there's no evidence that children with hearing loss can be successful multilingual learners. This is not true. We have evidence that children can successfully learn 2 or more languages, even if they have a profound hearing loss. Often when children are learning a second language or an additional language, there is a silent period where they're just receiving input and not saying anything, and that's often a cause for panic for people, but this is a completely normal part of being a multilingual language learner. There is a myth that's commonly out there that you can only learn a second language if you know a first language well. So you're building one language on top of the other. Completely not true. You can introduce a second language at any time. Learning 2 or more languages is confusing for children. Not the case. Children might make mistakes and get confused between the languages. I'm currently learning 2 languages at the same time, and I would suggest it's much more confusing for adult learners, but not so much for children. They sort it out way more quickly than we give them credit for. Bilingual So bilingual children will struggle with language at school. This is not necessarily the case. It can be quite challenging, especially if multilingual children are entering the school system with competency in only one language, and that's not the language that they're learning at school. But in the right environment, they will generally catch up. Some of my favorite, a multilingual person is the same as two monolingual people put together. And this is not true. Pauline's colleague speaks Dutch and French and English. You don't get the same competency and the same skills as you would in three monolingual speakers. But I would suggest that the result is something even better, because you get cross-linguistic interactions between those languages, which can sometimes be shown as errors, but it also can be shown as much more rapid acquisition, because you're applying things you know from one language to a new language. There's a myth that children with hearing loss can only learn one language well, whether we're talking about a sign language or a spoken language or within those categories. Again, this is not true. We are just not giving the kids the credit that they deserve. Multilingual children will have delayed language acquisition. Again, it's not true. Sometimes we might initially see some delays because they're obviously acquiring double the amount of language that a monolingual child is, but they do catch up. Sorry, and there's the next one. Multilingual children do catch up with their peers. This is kind of one of definition which very much varies between, well, I would say Australia and Europe. So only people who use all their language fluently are really multilingual. And often in the part of Europe I'm in, a multilingual person is only someone who's learnt two languages fluently from birth. Whereas I find in Australia, the definition is more being able to order a coffee in another language. It's a very different bar between countries as to what's multilingual. And also, as we just talked about, multilingualism is not rare. Like, there's this monolingual mindset in countries, especially like Australia and the US and the UK, that multilingualism is this exotic thing that few people achieve. And we talked about some of the data from Europe about multilingualism being common. And that's just because Europe is where we have data. If you look at some of the nations in Africa, and if you look at places like India, to speak 3 or 4 or 5 languages fluently is just a part of everyday life. It's nothing remarkable at all. The interpreter has frozen on my screen. Is that just me, or is there a connection issue?
He's frozen for me as well, so I'll just continue on until he sorts that out.
Do you know when he froze?
Just before you said he froze.
Okay, awesome. Okay. So the next one, another pet peeve of mine, some languages are easier to learn than others. I mean, this is a pet peeve because you walk into a classroom here and they're like, oh, Icelandic is the most difficult language in the world to learn. Like, you tried to learn Cantonese. So no language is more difficult or more hard than another language. It's all about the distance between the language that you speak and the language you're trying to learn. So if you're going from, say, English to French or English to German, it's a very small gap. But if you go from English to Arabic or English to Greenlandic would be, I think, the most outlandish example. It's a big jump. So it's not about hard or difficult, it's about language distance. And then code mixing is often frowned upon. So children shouldn't code mix. They should speak English and they should speak French, and they shouldn't speak them together. But this is just a normal part of multilingual, not just multilingual language acquisition, but actually just being multilingual. And again, it's a superpower. When I speak to my multilingual friends, I go, well, there is actually no English word for what I'm trying to describe. So I'll drop in a Danish word, or I'll use an Auslan sign. So code mixing is completely normal and not a sign of a problem and not a sign of laziness. And this one is also common. If you only focus on one language, the other one's that language is going to develop much more quickly. This is not the case. Languages will develop at a certain rate. Then if we look at deaf multilingual learners, we have some more myths that come into play. Deaf multilingual learners don't have the auditory skills to learn contrasts in more than one language. Well, again, we have evidence to suggest that they do. And it's just about learning those contrasts. So whether you have like a language like Icelandic, which has a much bigger consonant inventory than English, or a language like Maori, which has a much smaller consonant inventory, it's just about learning those contrasts and knowing where the overlaps and differences are. Learning two languages will confuse a deaf and hard of hearing child. Well, no, give them some credit. And also no more than it will confuse a hearing child. And we know that that's not necessarily true. Children don't need more than one sign language. From when I get this myth, I like to go back to the fact that there is multiple sign languages and there's lots of reasons for there being multiple sign languages. So yeah, we have a group of Ukrainian refugees who have just come to Iceland who are deaf. And those children definitely need more than one sign language to survive. Parents should always speak to their children in English. This is obviously when we're talking about countries that are English focused. No, definitely not. Parents should speak to their children in the language that they have greatest competence in. It's better to be bilingual in Arabic and English than to have a really bad English model and not get good acquisition of English. Deaf and hard of hearing can't get enough language input to be multilingual. Again, it's not true, and it's about what Pauline will talk about. It's about planning and making sure that you're setting that child up for success rather than having gaps in their language in both languages. It's one of my favorites. There's no point in exposing a child to additional languages unless you think that they can become fully fluent users. I mean, I guess we all start language learning hoping that we can become fluent users, but when do you become a fluent user? You gain the language you need to be able to cope in your environment. Deaf and hard of hearing have so much trouble. Children have so much trouble learning one language. Why would you make that worse by adding more languages? Well, it doesn't actually make it worse. And in fact, it can open the world up to more possibilities for that child. So that child has more people to learn language from, which they can then transfer that competence across languages. And they have more social opportunities to interact and to see the world in a different way. Yeah, deaf and hard of hearing children can be multilingual. That's the answer. They can only learn one language well. No, they will learn what they need to learn. And we have evidence to show that they can learn more than one language well. Deaf and hard of hearing children with additional needs cannot be multilingual. Well, again, it's not true. It's the same argument that's been used for a long time, saying that children with Down syndrome can only be monolingual, or children with autism spectrum disorder can only be monolingual. It's not true. And again, for some of those children, they have better outcomes from being multilingual because suddenly their world is open to more people that they can communicate with. Deaf and hard of hearing children don't need to speak the language of their family. They just need to speak the language of education, which is a thing that we hear far too often. And that's horrible. That's just like telling parents, well, if your child's learning Auslan, you don't need to learn to sign. Of course, the child needs a language which they can interact with the people who love them. And you must have English first in order to succeed at school. This is not true. You need a language first. We can sort out which language later, but you need early input of language. And it doesn't matter if that is Arabic or Cantonese or Auslan. You need language first, and we can work on the English later. So when you put all of those together, there is a lot of myths running around about deaf multilingual learners. And we hope that what we're talking about today is going to help give you the information you need to go out and fight some of these myths. And especially if you have a deaf multilingual child, to be able to advocate for your child more strongly. So we're just going to talk a little bit about what is multilingual acquisition of language. So I'm going to just give an example now. So as researchers, we're like genetically programmed almost to put people into neat little categories. Obviously, they don't work so well because real life is much messier than that. But we're going to give you some examples of the prototypes of different kinds of multilinguals, standard multilinguals. So imagine this family. They've moved from Turkey. I hope this works. I spent so much time on this animation last night. Then they moved to Australia. They moved to Bathurst in particular. Now, Nahir moved to Bathurst when she was 18 months old. And so she's been learning Turkish from her parents at home and English at preschool in the community. And she is what we would call a simultaneous multilingual because she's learning both languages at the same time. And she's got those foundational competencies in both languages at the same time. Whereas her brother, Surat, moved to Bathurst when he was 8 years old. He spoke Turkish very well when he arrived in Australia, and he speaks English at school and with his friends in the community. And he's a sequential multilingual because he had competence in one language, and early in his life, he built competence in a second language on top of that first language competence. Now, Aylin, their mum, is what we would call a subordinate multilingual because now she speaks English well in her everyday life, but she has a stronger and quite a preference for the Turkish language. And then Dala is in a different situation to Aylin because he grew up in the US and English is his native language, but he started learning Turkish when he was 18 and spoke it for 10 years while he lived in Turkey. But now being back in an English-speaking country, he's using less Turkish and he's beginning to lose his Turkish skills. So he would be what we would call a subtractive multilingual. And note, as I said, real life is much messier than that. For example, you can be a subtractive multilingual when you're just 3 years old. So we see a child that moves into a preschool environment and is not getting their support in their home language, and they're starting to lose skills in the home language. So for me, myself, I'm a sequential, subordinate, and subtractive multilingual, depending on which language you're talking about. So this is what makes multilingualism so slippery to describe and so slippery to study. So like I said before, it's important to remember that you are not, a multilingual learner is not the combination of several monolingual learners. When these languages go together in one mind, they're not stored in little separate compartments. They work together and they interact. So what you know about phonology in the sound systems in English and Turkish interact. There are some sounds that overlap, there are some sounds that are different. There are some sound combinations that you can have, some are different. And the same goes for how grammar works. And the same goes for sign languages as well. You might be growing competency in Auslan and Turkish Sign Language, but if you understand how spatial grammar works, then that is going to transfer between those two languages. So a multilingual speaker and multilingual language acquisition is not the same as for monolinguals. So this means that multilingual acquisition does not look the same for multilinguals and monolinguals. And as professionals, it can be really hard to differentiate what is a difference, so multilingual language acquisition being different, and then what is actually a disorder, because we don't want to miss the kids that have some kind of developmental language disorder or speech sound disorder and say, oh, it's just that they're multilingual. But if they have a difficulty in both languages, then that is something that we need to address. That is not a catch-up situation. Children will have different skills across languages. And you can't expect equal skills in each language, especially when they're using things in vocabulary and grammar in different contexts. So, for example, they might only know the names for things in the kitchen in their home language and not have that in their school language, because that's something that they're never going to encounter. And this is part of this. You have a different vocabulary across languages. That doesn't necessarily point to a sign of disorder or weakness. This is just things are different depending on the languages that you're using. Code mixing, code switching, lexical borrowing, these are all natural parts of language, multilingual language acquisition and multilingual, just being a multilingual, which doesn't mean that you have a problem. And it doesn't always necessarily even mean that you don't know that word in the other language. Sometimes it's a matter of vocabulary selection and inhibition. So you might be going for the word in English, but the word in French is the one that pops up first. So again, it's superpower, not disorder. There's positive transfer and negative transfer across languages. So for example, when I came to Icelandic, I have most of the sounds I need to learn Icelandic. There's a couple of horrific vowels, which I don't have, and I swear I will never learn to produce. And then cool sounds like that you have to learn. So there's some positive transfer, and then there's some differences. And then you can get negative transfer as well. So in Icelandic, we have the trilled R, like, and then I accidentally found myself sometimes saying English words with the instead of a normal R. So you can have that negative transfer as well. Silent periods, again, totally normal. It's language acquisition is kind of like filling a glass. You can keep putting the input in, but you don't actually see anything coming out until you've filled up that cup. So if you think about kids' brains as like a cup, you're not going to see any language coming out until you've put so much input in. There are differences between the phonological sound systems of languages. So spoken languages, it's sound system. For sign languages, it's the handshake, orientation, location, movement. So those parameters are what we consider like the sound system of sign languages. And you have differences, and that's why you can see differences in accent, differences in dialect, and differences in the phonology that's actually expressed. And then another part of multilingual language acquisition can be language loss and language attrition. So if you don't use it, you do lose it, and you can lose it pretty quickly. So now we're going to move on to how we can support multilingual language acquisition.
Okay, I thought, Kate, that you would talk for these 2 slides, and then I will do the next.
Yep, sorry, I can't count. Okay, so when it comes to making decisions about what language or languages a child would speak, there's a lot that goes into that. And so we've had a little bit of look about how those decisions are made. So we have a lot of information on that with children who are typically hearing, but not so much about children with hearing loss. So we asked, something's gone wrong with the pictures. We asked parents about what factors they thought were important in making decisions for their child with hearing loss. And we also asked professionals. We used exactly the same factors and asked the parents what they thought was important in deciding whether or not their child would use more than one spoken language. And for the parents, they thought that child factors, so such as when was the hearing loss diagnosed, what age did we get hearing aids, when did we start early intervention? These were really important, as well as professional factors. what the professionals were telling them about multilingualism was really important in how parents made decisions. But then when we asked professionals, it was exactly the opposite was what they thought was important. The professionals barely mentioned things like degree of hearing loss and an age of intervention, which were things that we thought professionals would find really important. But the professionals' attitude was, well, if they've got skills, they've got skills. It doesn't really matter how they came about. They were really much more interested in family and community factors. So what's the language proficiency of the family? How does language work within the family? What are the family's goals about who this child will need to speak to and the languages they'll need for their everyday life? And then for the community, how are the languages that the parents speak and want for their child going to be supported in the education system, in early intervention, in community settings? So who's going to provide that language input and language support for the children? So it's really important to think that different people in this discussion about how to make decisions about multilingualism are coming from very different perspectives. So we need really clear discussions about not only what you think, what decision you're making, but why you're making that decision, because that can really, really help unpack some of those myths that we were talking about and lead to like more informed decision making. Now it's Polly.
Okay, so now I hope and we hope you know that deaf children can become multilingual, and honestly for professionals like speech pathologists it's great news. But multilingual development is not so easy and it requires strong environmental support. All the members of the child's environment are invited to support the child. Let's see how to do that. So to support deaf multilingual learners or deaf learners to become multilingual, here are some advice. First of all, create a context that is positive towards multilingualism and favorable for multilingual acquisition. Second, plan the language use. So the child will have sufficient exposure to each language. Then provide adequate, not only sufficient, but adequate exposure to each language. And finally, as adults, the adults involved in the child's education or rehabilitation, let's collaborate with each other. So the first need of multilingual children is to grow up in a context that is positive toward multilingualism and towards all languages and culture. Then it is important that diverse languages are made visible and valued, for example, in the environment, in the context. Languages could be stamped on the ground in a playground or in the street. Then this is a poster, the tree of languages, where we can write the word hello or good morning, bonjour, in many languages. At home, at school, or in the therapy room, we can also have books in multiple languages. And it is also easy and fun to listen to songs from all over the world. Moreover, languages and multilingualism can be illustrated as a part of the child. For example, this is a language portrait. So everyone in a family, in a classroom, or even during a speech pathology session could make their own language portrait. And it is a great way to see each one's perspective on their languages, the place and the emotional aspects associated with each language. Another example is the dominant language constellations. So the idea is to represent your own languages and your multilingual identity through art craft with Play-Doh, with craft material, colors, anything is possible. A positive and favorable context is a context in which the child feels safe and feels welcome with his or her languages and cultures. But more than respecting and welcoming multilingualism, this can be seen as a superpower, and children really love to hear that. So to develop a language, a child needs interactions in the language with competent locutors. And this is true for all children, even monolinguals, and particularly true for deaf children. To ensure that a multilingual child will get sufficient interactions, so sufficient time in each language, it may be necessary to plan language use. That means who speaks which language or languages with the child, where and when. And explicit planning of language use in the family is called family language policy or family language strategy. So this is a short video about choosing a family language strategy. The video was created by the European project PEACH, and the video is in English, but captions are available in the 27 European languages.
Raising a bilingual child starts with a plan, a family language strategy that determines who will speak what language and when. There is no one-size-fits-all approach to raising a bilingual child, or better said, there are many ways of doing it right. Here are 4 steps that will help you choose a language strategy that is tailored to your family. Step 1. Define your goals. What languages do you want your child to learn? What are your expectations in terms of fluency? Do you want to teach your child to read and write in your language? Step 2. Once you know where you want to go, think about how you'll get there and analyze your family situation. Who can speak which languages? Will one of you spend more or less time with your child? What will be the school language? These questions will help you figure out how much exposure your child will get to each language. In step 3, you align your goals with your family situation. Are the goals realistic, considering the exposure you'll be able to give your child in each language? If necessary, rethink and adjust your goals. The final step is to pick a language strategy that works best for your family. Common strategies are OPOL, or one person, one language, minority language at home, time and place, or 2 parents, 2 languages. The best strategy or combination of strategies is the one where your child gets a balanced exposure to each language. For more advice on this, download the PEACH Guide for bilingual children. And remember, no matter how the bilingual journey unfolds, be proud of every step.
Thank you. So to help parents in planning language use, another European project called Planting Languages created a booklet. And this booklet is available in 5 languages: English, French, Dutch, Polish, and Greek. Step by step, parents are guided to reflect on their own skills, their resources, their goals and wishes for the child's multilingual development, and finally to make a decision. And this decision can be communicated to the family members, to the educators. The more people involved in supporting the child, the greater the chance of success. And of course, language use is something dynamic, and new decisions can be made as the child grows up. Planning language use is relevant to ensure the amount of exposure to each language, but quantity is not enough. The child also needs adequate exposure with good quality. And usually parents of deaf children know what adequate linguistic exposure means. But the more languages there are in a child's life, the more challenging it is. Are you okay, Kate, with the screen sharing? And okay, so about the how to expose the child to high quality linguistic exposure in everyday routines and everyday interactions, the Peach Project also made a video on this topic.
In between work, social life and parenting, it can be a challenge to squeeze in some time to practice the home language with your child. Fortunately, there are many ways to practice that require little time and energy. Here are some ideas on how to integrate language learning in your family's everyday life. Number 1. Run a live commentary of your life. In other words, speak to your child as much as you can. Describe your actions out loud. The more input they get in the home language, the better. Number 2. Involve your child in household work, like cooking, doing the laundry, or working in the garden. Give them instructions and have them perform small tasks for you. Number 3. Ask open-ended questions while your child is playing to stimulate language production. Ask them what they're doing or which story they are enacting and how it will evolve. Number 4. Play word games. You can do this whenever there's a few minutes to spare. In the car, before bedtime, or even in the supermarket. Ask your child to point at all the objects that start with a particular sound, or to identify objects in a picture. Number 5. Screen time in the home language can be valuable, but only if there's an interactive component. When your child is watching TV, discuss the plot and the characters with them. Talk about what's happening. This will encourage them to transform the language input into language production. For more advice and ideas, download the Peach Guide for Bilingual Children. And remember, no matter how the bilingual journey unfolds, be proud of every step.
You probably know that some language techniques or language strategies are particularly supportive of the child's language development. For example, offering choices to the child and adding a word to the child's sentence. These techniques are favorable for all children, monolingual, bilingual, especially for children with hearing loss. And here we share that some visuals of these techniques are available in many languages. And these kind of visuals can be useful if you want to share this information with people who will speak a language different than yours with your child. Finally, about adequate exposure in each language, shared storybook reading or shared oral narrations, songs with gesture are powerful activities when learning a new language. They are powerful to support language development, but also to share and to convey cultural elements. And then multilingual children need everyone involved to work together as a team. Parents, extended families, educators from the daycare center or from school, the professionals, such as speech pathologists. And these are some tips from a wonderful and recent book on deaf multilingual learners. And this is a guide for educators and teachers, also created by the European Peach Project. And as you heard in the video, Peach Project also did a guide for the parents.
So then what do our deaf multilingual learners need? They need the favorable context, they need planned language use, exposure to each language, and collaborative involvement of all stakeholders. So what our deaf multilingual learners need is basically the same as what learners need, whether they're deaf or hearing, monolingual or multilingual. They need adequate exposure to all languages. And to ensure this, we need rich language and literacy environments. We need engaging and skilled models of all languages. We need to monitor progress in the languages that are used so that we can identify problems when they occur. We need good communication between home and school and different contexts where different languages are happening. And as always, failing to plan is planning to fail. Raising a child to be multilingual without a hearing loss is quite challenging, especially in a context like Australia that's heavily monolingual heavily monolingual towards one language. So without a plan, it is very hard to raise a child to be multilingual. So all the tips that Pauline's given are what our kids need. So we have some references here of some things that might be that more parent friendly and supportive if you want to get some more information on these topics. And at the bottom we have a QR code, so if you want to know about research that is happening in Australia and opportunities to participate for research related to issues for deaf multilingual learners, please just leave your details there and we'll contact you every time we know of a study that's happening. And then finally, if you'd like some more information, please feel free to contact us. We do love hearing from parents. So if you have any questions or concerns, or you want some more information on something, please get in touch with us.